Hello everyone, and thank you for listening to this talk. My name is Pedro Ferreira and I'm an associate professor at the IT University of Copenhagen. I am here to present my paper examining the local in ICT4D, a postcolonial perspective on participation. ICT4D, from its inception, has dealt with thorny and intricate issues such as power differentials existing between researchers and the communities that are being engaged. One broad set of issues is that everything local, culture, knowledge, and local voices have been overlooked in some of these projects. This has led to ICT4D's participatory turn, something which happened as well in broader development work. However, ICT4D's participatory turn has likely overlooked some earlier development critiques. Another aspect of ICT4D's attempts at mitigating some of these issues related with power has been an adoption of postcolonial and decolonial perspectives. Postcolonial perspectives in ICT4D have, as mentioned, mostly sought to address some of these power imbalances. However, in broader postcolonial theory, the focus has mainly been on representations. So, the main idea in broader postcolonial theory, from Edward Said to others, has been this reversing of the Western gaze, meaning that as the West represents the other, we ought to look inwards at the epistemic practices of such representations to expose the politics of power that are embedded and emanent from them. The methodology here is a discourse analysis of the term local that builds on a curated corpus of HCI4D publications that are curated for relevance and representativeness. This is a curation that, while it builds on quantitative indicators, such as using citation counts as an indication of relevance, it ultimately makes inclusion and exclusion criteria in a deliberate and reflexive and transparent manner. The term local is used as a generative and not as an exhaustive prompt, given how much representational work happens using a variety of other terms. The analysis builds on three main themes. The first one is familiar to those those acquainted with postcolonial theory, essentializing the local. A second one has to do with the privileged positionality to which the researchers and projects are ascribed. And finally, how discourse analysis of the local promotes and enables a politics of extraction. There are more details in the paper, which I hope you will read, so I will only touch upon a few examples to give you a flavor of what you will find if you do decide to read the paper. Essentialism is a typical component of postcolonial analysis, and it builds on things like exotification, where communities tend to be represented by emphasizing their difference. And this happens in a multitude of ways. You can look a little bit more at the paper. Here we will shift towards the second aspect, which is homogenization, which is similar but slightly different. So, homogenization is a common analyzed discourse in a postcolonial context, where communities tend to be described in single and fixed terms. So, for instance, in one of the publications we analyzed, the community is characterized as egalitarian in nature. Every community member, irrespective of age and gender, has a say in decision making in community meetings.
However, the Council of Elders is a supreme decision-making institution. And so we see how ascribing this singular consciousness to the community makes it very amenable to an epistemic endeavor such as an ICT4D or HCI4D project, by allowing, for instance, among many other things, the knowledge and access to knowledge to be proxied by a local authority or a local champion or anyone else given that kind of epistemic status.
Now, a final aspect of essentialism that might be less familiar is hyperbolic admiration. Hyperbolic admiration is a term that is borrowed from Jacques Derrida, defined as a kind of opposite, but also similar in some of its implications around the concept of ethnocentric scorn. So ethnocentric scorn is the more familiar way through which discourses tended to disparage, demean, degrade the colonized other subjects in more obvious discourses that tended to have a negative impact. However, in ICT4D, we find a more complementary type of vocabulary, such as egalitarian, as we've seen before, but also describing cultures as rich, extensive, creative, or layered. Derrida argues that, and others have argued that, this hyperbolic admiration, while at times seemingly strategic and elevating the subject status, it does typically produce a consolidated other that is deprived of complex agency. Furthermore, and as a consequence, it also tends to overlook existing power dynamics that exist in every community and every setting. To the third and the second theme of our analysis, which is privileged positionality. So we see, for instance, here how authors regularly claim to see from within or having an insider status. This happens often by virtue of them spending time in the field and drawing on that to then represent the field in a first-person perspective. We also see some examples of acts of explicit positionality, some of which would be positionality statements, which some of you might be familiar with, and which come from a reflexive tradition of trying to make knowledge production more accountable. However, positionality statements, by and large, ultimately tend to grant a authority position to the researcher by claiming a partial insider status, for instance. We also see examples of descriptive authority. Descriptive authority, or when researchers tend to grant themselves the authority to broadly describe aspects of the culture that they're engaging with or even the results of their work, happens in multiple ways. One way, which is maybe a little bit striking to illustrate my point, comes from a survey of non-Western researchers and how they perceive decolonizing perspectives as productive in challenging globalized, dominant Western worldviews. When faced with what seems largely a lack of interest from the researchers, the authors reinterpret the results, or seem to reinterpret the results, as the researchers being under a micro-colonization paradox. So as I described, local researchers perceive decolonization as belonging to the past and believe that a globalized worldview, which is unavoidably dominated by Western discourses, is the way forward. The trouble with this position lies in the fact that a globalized worldview is universal rather than pluriversal, and hence is not reflective of local realities. So we see here very clearly how when the local does not say what is expected, it can also be overruled and reinterpreted. Tactics of extraction are enabled discursively in a variety of ways. The most obvious and first one is by suggesting participatory approaches as common sense, as delivering better outcomes in an obvious manner. This is, of course, striking given how much HCI4D work does not actually measure or analyze benefits in any meaningful manner. Another issue is autonomy, which tends to isolate communities by suggesting that their knowledge is unique, but also that the systems and solutions designed should be self-sustained, based on self-reliance, based on an isolation from the rest of the world. This is, of course, more suitable to the scopes of projects than it is to a more global understanding of solidarity. Finally, we look at deferral a little bit more in detail. And deferral is a strategy by which difficult issues in the field are resolved by appealing to the epistemic authority of a member of the community. So, to quote a project, most ICT4D projects are coordinated with local partners embedded in the target communities. It is common for ICT4D researchers to defer to the expertise of these local partners, particularly in matters related to local practices or culture. While this does not at first seem problematic, it does produce an isolated, homogenizing understanding of communities, downplaying conflict, tensions, and different interests, and of course, ultimately being extremely vulnerable to practices of elite capture, where certain in-group privileged members tend to gain a position from which to speak on behalf of the broader group. Discussion. The paper proposes a set of concrete recommendations, of which, for instance, the need for projects to justify participatory approaches rather than taking them for granted, the need to specify clear and tangible benefits in ICT4D interventions, benefits to the communities, as well as the need to detail difficult and intractable compromises that have been made, rather than attempting to paint a clear picture of participatory success. However, deferral, of course, suggests a very narrow and inadequate understanding of power. It obscures the roles of researchers and is antithetical to a politics of solidarity, as it asks for those in the receiving end to shoulder the burden of knowledge and sustaining some of these initiatives that we ought to share collectively, especially given our privileged educational and socioeconomic backgrounds. Another aspect that is maybe worth mentioning is how around representation and difference. And here the work is very much inspired in Gayatri Spivak's famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, where she talks about how academia in the West has conflated the dual meaning of representation as a political understanding, where you are speaking on behalf of someone else, and a more artistic pictorial understanding, where you are describing something. And so through this conflation, Spivak argues, the presence of the representer is erased, as Ilan Kapoor aptly describes. To speak about the other, Spivak argues, we must disavow our own role in the representational process as though we are transparent and neutral relays. And so part of the argument of this paper is that the differences and the tensions in the field between researchers and communities needs to be emphasized and worked with rather than erased and made unproblematic. To conclude, this paper tries to problematize the local participatory impetus as sustaining rather than challenging the status quo, and essentially serving mainly to legitimize the HCI4D encounter itself. It is not meant as an indictment of the work analyzed, as post-colonial analysis tend to focus purely on representational and not on the normative evaluation of the merits of the projects. This is what I had. I hope that you will read the paper, and I look forward to your questions.